Welcome to Lecture 3 of BRITE Old Testament 508, the Pentateuch. In this particular class, we're going to be looking at Israel's covenant. We've talked about the covenant so many other times in this class that this lecture will actually not be all that long. But let's go ahead and dive in. The covenant between God and Israel is found predominantly in the book of Deuteronomy. However, Deuteronomy literally means second law. And that is because there are great portions of the book of Deuteronomy that are found earlier in the Pentateuch. Exodus chapters 20 through 24 would be the largest section, but we also have sections of Numbers 34 through 36 that are found in Deuteronomy, as well as elements from the book of Leviticus. But really, the covenant with Israel starts in Genesis chapter 12 and 15 with Abraham, which is then passed on to Isaac in chapter 26, Jacob in Bethel at chapter 28, and then in chapter 46, as Jacob talks about going down to Egypt, God promises that he will go with him to Egypt, but also bring Israel out. Then God recalls the covenant to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as he talks to Moses in chapters 4 and chapter 6 of the book of Exodus. Then Israel arrives at Mount Sinai, chapters 20 through 24, where we have some laws. And then again, Numbers 34 through 36 as they prepare to enter into the promised land. All of which is summarized then and encapsulated in the book of Deuteronomy. Much of Deuteronomy is actually new information, so that we could say that the covenant is both revealed and repeated in the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy itself follows after a very common form of covenant, so it is established as a covenant treaty document, but we have to keep in mind that it is summarizing and building upon all that has come before in Israel's covenantal history. The structure of Deuteronomy is based upon the traditional form of a covenant, what is often called a suzerain vassal treaty. The suzerain is the lord, the vassal are those who serve the suzerain, who serve the Lord. The Hittites made this form very famous, although we've also seen elements of this type of treaty in Egyptian documents, which is probably where Israel learned it. The Hittites lived in what is modern-day Turkey, so it's unlikely that they would have known of the form from the Hittites themselves, probably as the Hittite form trickled down and was used in Egypt. We see a shorter form of this suzerain vassal treaty even in Exodus chapter 20, as God is making the covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai. Here in Deuteronomy, we have the major sections in expanded form. So rather than simply having the introduction in Exodus chapter 20, verse 1, we have here 3 chapters that form the historical prologue, explaining not only the history of the people, but explaining the history of what the suzerain has done for the vassal, why the vassal owes allegiance to the suzerain. So here, Israel is remembering their deliverance from Egypt, but remembering that God is the one who delivered them from Egypt. Therefore, they owe God obedience to his covenant. We have a general legal introduction in chapters 4 through 11, beginning in chapter 4, verse 1. And now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the rules that I'm teaching you. Do them that you may live. And then concluding in chapter 11, verses 31 through 32, you're to cross over the Jordan, go in, take possession of the land the Lord your God is giving you. When you possess it and live in it, be careful to do all the statutes and the rules that I'm setting before you today. In between chapter 4 and chapter 11, we have a general explanation, a general reminder of the fact that Israel came to the promised land not because they are more righteous than the other nations. They came because God graciously gave Israel the land and because the wickedness of the other nations was so great. So there is a general warning throughout these chapters for Israel not to adopt the worship practices or the other behaviors of these nations. Otherwise, God will do to Israel exactly what he's done to the nations before them. This sets the stage then for the specific rules that will follow in chapter 12. The specific laws continue through Deuteronomy chapter 26. Beginning in chapter 12, verse 1, we read, "These are the statutes and the rules that you shall be careful to do in the land the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you." The laws then continue on all the way through chapter 26, but they're not all the same type of law. Chapter 13, for instance, has some causistic laws. If this happens, then this, versus the apodictic laws, which are found in Deuteronomy chapter 5 as a repeat of Exodus chapter 20 and the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not. Deuteronomy chapter 20 also has some causistic laws and following from chapter 20. When you do this, then you shall do this. Chapter 14 and following really contains a lot of information that's found in Leviticus and Numbers. Unclean animals, city of refuges, etc. Deuteronomy 18 is famous because it talks about a prophet like Moses, later fulfilled in Christ as the great prophet, but even fulfilled in the other prophets that would come prior to the time of Christ. Deuteronomy chapter 20 and following, in addition to containing those casuistic laws that deal with when this, then this, also have a lot of new laws that we've not seen before. So again, it's not completely true that Deuteronomy is simply a repetition of all that has come before. There is some new that is revealed here in the covenant. In chapter 27, we have a transition all the way through the end of chapter 29. Really, chapter 29, verse 1 in the English Bible is the end of chapter 28 in the Hebrew Bible, and serves as a summary. These are the words of the covenant that the Lord commanded Moses to make with the people of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant that he made with them at Horeb. So in addition to the covenant at Sinai, which dealt a lot with clean and unclean, dealt a lot with the tabernacle and its construction, but also was the Ten Commandments, Exodus chapter 20 through 24, which is repeated here to a large degree in Deuteronomy, and yet then also greatly expanded upon. Chapters 27 through 29 not only conclude the covenant, but they also talk about the curses, all the things that are going to get poured out on Israel if they disobey, but also the blessings for obedience, as well as hints at the unconditional nature of God, that he is going to do for Israel what he's promised to do, even if they disobey and are sent away to a foreign land. He will bring them back. He will establish them according to his loving kindness, according to his mercy. Again, not because they deserved it, not because they're better, but simply because God decided to do it. Deuteronomy 29 through chapter 30 is a warning, a charge from Moses. You have this covenant, now choose life. Actually follow this covenant, as well as witnesses that are referenced in chapters 30 through chapter 31 in two places, verse 19 in both chapters, as well as the Song of Moses in chapter 32, verses 1 through 43, that are really explaining the witness of the song itself, that it testifies against Israel should they disobey. In Deuteronomy chapter 31, we have a discussion of the change of leadership to Joshua. Chapters 31 through 32 is again that Song of Moses that testifies against Israel that they have to obey. And then Deuteronomy 32 concludes the book with the death of Moses. This is really, again, the preparation for ending in the Promised Land. Israel's not yet in the Promised Land, and yet there is an assumption that that is where they are going. This is the final preparation, as it were, before they head over. Here is the covenant. Remember what God promised. Remember what God has said. Remember what you are to do in obedience to him, or he will drive you out of the Promised Land that you are preparing to inherit. One of the difficulties with the book of Deuteronomy is that as we have walked through Deuteronomy very quickly here, we seem to get the impression that Deuteronomy is not all that complicated. And really, it's not. It's actually very simple, very straightforward. It's a treaty. It's a covenant between God and Israel, one that began all the way back in Exodus chapter 4, where God said, "You'll be my people, and I will be your God, and I will dwell in your midst," which is emphasized again and again in the book of Deuteronomy, but also that began all the way back in Genesis chapter 12, where God said, "I will make you a great nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through you." And yet, at the same time, Deuteronomy is a summation of all that has come before and preps Israel for going into the Promised Land. And yet Deuteronomy is the book that Israel will appeal to the most throughout the rest of its history. In the historical books, Deuteronomy 17 will come to play as they talk about having a king. There's instructions in Deuteronomy 17 as to what the king is supposed to do. They will again and again go back to the law in Deuteronomy and elsewhere, but in Deuteronomy to look at what they are supposed to do, how they are supposed to live, how they're supposed to act. We see Deuteronomy in the poets as David talks about the law, as they apply the law to Israel, as we see the system of blessings and curses being debated and discussed in the book of Proverbs, and to some degree, although not explicitly mentioned, even in the book of Job. And we see Deuteronomy especially in the prophets, because it's the book of the law in Deuteronomy that Israel's prophets will use to condemn Israel. as Israel's prophets come as the prosecuting attorneys to prosecute the nation for their failure to obey the law. Deuteronomy is a simple summation, but also Deuteronomy forms that foundation for Israel in their relationship with God, setting the stage for Israel's interaction with God for the next 1,000 years, but also even showing us today what it is that God requires of us, as we remember that the things that God has kept secret belong to him, but those things that he has revealed belong to us and our children forever.